and there's literally no way you can organise a riot, and that's, yeah, we're having a riot, it's going to be amazing. I'm on the phone, leave me be, I'm on the phone.
On May 25th, 2020, a man passed away during a confrontation with a police officer in Minneapolis, and the entire world subsequently collectively said, it's been a mild spring, maybe we can turn up the heat by setting absolutely everything on fire. This lust for revenge was in response to what was clearly an improper use of force, to put it in a YouTube-friendly way, as if there's any chance that this video gets monetized given its sensitive subject matter. In the following weeks, the United States has been burning, with massive protests in almost every major city, and even the city of Seattle, or part of it, pretending to secede from the US. In all of this chaos and pandemonium, decrying the US as a fundamentally racist country, calls to abolish the police, the destruction of historical landmarks, and countless incidences of robbing and looting, it's hard to ignore the very basic fact that for all of this rage directed at the right and Trump, it's cities that vote almost exclusively Democrat who have been burning down their own neighborhoods, tearing down statues of people they don't know anything about, and haphazardly rebuilding it all as a lawless, glorious people's autonomous zone, complete with Hardy Garden and SoundCloud rapper Warlord. My immediate response was, why would you do that? And to figure out why they did that, we can look at the social sciences in both theory and in practice to provide us with some answers to these questionable actions. Why are people looting and destroying their own neighborhoods and burning down their own homes and towns? Why are people taking a dump where they eat, to put it poetically? As with most things, the answers are usually complicated, but by looking into the psychology of looting and rioting, I think we might just find some answers. So let's take a deep dive into the psychology of riots, why they happen, when they happen, and who is likely to be a participant, starting with some major theories that might help make some sense of the seemingly senseless destruction and the bizarre establishment of the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, or whatever it's being called by this point, by looking at social contagion, crime pattern theory, and social disorganization, just to start. But first, a quick word from my sponsor, Surfshark VPN. Given media censorship and cancel culture is at a peak high right now, particularly regarding a topic like this one, ensuring your security online is more important now than ever. Browse your favorite websites without worrying about the safety of your data, which is particularly at risk if you use public Wi-Fi. But not with Surfshark. Just a simple click and your browsing is protected. I like Surfshark because of their easy-to-use browser extension that lets me quickly switch my region to access all kinds of shows and movies that aren't available where I live. If you're living in the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, that allows you to switch your IP address to the United States so you can shitpost on 4chan without having whatever cringy flag Raz decides to assign to his Chaz. But for the rest of us, Surfshark unlocks media you wouldn't otherwise have access to in your real country. For example, Doctor Who isn't available in the United States, but with Surfshark, you might as well be accessing the site from Britbongland. Finally, Surfshark makes it easy to block ads on your mobile devices, saving you data. So if Surfshark sounds like the right VPN for you, click the link in the description of this video to get 24 months of Surfshark for a whopping 85% off, plus 3 months absolutely free. If you don't like it, no problem, because Surfshark comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee, no questions asked. So now that your access to the internet is safe and secure, let's discuss a bit of a dangerous topic, the psychology and theories of rioting. There are 3 theories that we can look to that describe the precipitators of crime: social contagion, crime pattern theory, and social disorganization theory, as well as many other variables that lead to increased criminal activity. So let's go through these theories and precipitators to see how and why people make the active decision to engage in illegal behavior such as rioting and looting, if that decision is active and cognizant at all. In terms of theory to help us further understand this behavior, let's first look to contagion. Social contagion is the process through which ideas or actions spread through the zeitgeist and become replicated by others. Myers and Shibij, 2011, define contagion as a rational form of inter-actor influence in which potential actors observe and evaluate the outcomes of others' behavior and then make a decision for themselves about whether or not to adopt the behavior. Rioters calculate a lower than average risk of apprehension given the chaos of a riot, and thus form a rational decision based on information available to them, usually from others via social interaction, to also engage in illegal behavior. This spreads via social contagion to nearby areas and can spread between groups of people online. Ben Simon and Bodner 2011 examined the effects of contagion on aggression by measuring how much chanting occurred during football games. That's European football, not American hand-egg. For all viewers of a football game, merely watching the game increased aggression over time. But aggression in chanters was also significantly higher than non-chanters. Before the game, aggression levels were similar for both chanters and non-chanters, but after the game, the chanters had worked themselves into a frenzy of aggression. The Israeli participants in this sample made themselves so angry by chanting that those who chanted were only slightly more aggressive than the average American sports fan. And that's really saying something about the power of contagious behavior if you're familiar with the antics of American football games.
Grain alcohol, baby. Whenever there's a potential riot, I'm getting blasted on grain alcohol.
Riot juice!
Rum punch!
Put some of that on my bug bites.
Classical experiments in psychology have long noted that humans are prone to behavioral contagion, a kind of monkey see, monkey do effect. Wait, don't take that the wrong way. YouTube, please don't strike me for using an idiom. Let's instead use the official term for it, social learning theory. Albert Bandura's famous Bobo doll experiment illustrated how children may be more likely to act violently towards a toy when they see adults being violent towards that toy. A contemporary study to Bandura's experiments from Lefkowitz, Blake, and Mouton all the way back in 1955, so still pretty old, found that people were more likely to jaywalk when they saw an experimenter do it first, particularly when the law violator was wearing a suit and therefore seen as higher status. We have to go back to such ancient examples of experiments because social learning theory is a bit of a tricky thing to study from an ethical perspective. If you have a good reason to think something is going to trigger violent or criminal behavior, it's a bit of a problem to then intentionally attempt to induce those behaviors in the laboratory. That doesn't mean there's been no research done on it though, as a meta-analysis of 133 studies on social learning theory as it applies specifically to criminality, also known as social learning theory of deviance, was conducted by Pratt et al. In 2010, and found that the behaviors of peers and to a lesser degree parents and other non-peers was positively related to criminal behavior. This means that simply watching your peers commit crimes may produce a mirroring effect. In further analysis of the predictors of crime, age was important, as in juveniles and in young people, watching the behavior of their peers was a predictor of crime. In young adults, but not in juveniles, the attitude towards crime of their peers also predicted their own criminal behavior. These data indicate that for adults, seeing the behavior of criminals and sharing positive attitudes towards crime in their peer group are potential, albeit weak, potential incipient factors for their own acts of crime. When taken alone, it's unlikely that seeing criminal behavior among one's peer group, and even agreeing with their attitudes towards crime, is likely to create a culture of criminality in a single generation. However, the effects are statistically significant, meaning that when instead taken in addition to other factors, social learning theory provides a small piece of the puzzle in understanding who, when, and why people are likely to engage in criminal activities. Because just watching others can produce mimicking of criminal behavior, does that mean crime is contagious? Well, Jury et al. 2019 examined the social contagion effect. This effect causes criminal behavior to be spread from person to person. Drury's study looked specifically at the contagious nature of violent crime in the context of the 2011 London riots following the shooting of Mark Duggan by police. In their interview with people who participated, there was a sense that everyone was doing it, and thus engaging in rioting was seen as socially normative. Once the interviewees knew others would be rioting, they reported feeling compelled to get involved as well. For example, one participant described the situation which occurred in London following the shooting thusly.
Well, from what I recall, the first thing I heard was that the police shot someone, and after that broadcast, I started apping on my BlackBerry saying that because of what the police is doing, it's time to cause a rebellion, basically, isn't it? Like, action has to be taken, like.
Indicating that as it became more clear that others were rioting, said riots became a symbol of rebellion and a call to action for others to join in. Once there's a perception that everyone's doing it, it becomes easier for people to justify to themselves that they can or should engage in the same behavior, for as another interviewee stated,
After everyone heard about the Tottenham thing, there was this thing going around that everyone's going to do it in Brixton, but I wasn't sure that I want to be that
yeah.
sort of thing, so
What was going around?
everyone's going to start a riot.
If everyone else is rioting, it becomes normal to riot as well. Watching others commit violent acts then can itself influence and encourage additional acts of violence, because when everyone is doing it, not only is there social pressure to conform, but also a perception that no one individual is likely to be caught and charged for those illegal actions. Our next theory of interest, crime pattern theory, suggests that people create a mental map of places that they frequent and use that information in their mental maps to formulate how to commit acts of crime. Think of a heist movie where the characters case their target before enacting their elaborate plan, except applied to the real world wherein people and their limited resources, cognitive, temporal, or otherwise, are essentially doing the same type of casing in their day-to-day lives. Thus, outside of fiction, this theory posits people are more likely to commit crimes close to their homes, where they are familiar with the location and the path to and from the target, where there are few obstacles to travel. Claire, Fernandez, and Morgan, 2009, examined how obstacles to travel influence propensity to burglarize in the world's largest prison, Australia, and found evidence for this effect. That is, as distance increased, the likelihood of criminality decreased. Young people were less likely to travel far to their destination target than were adults, which makes sense as young people may have more limited mental maps of areas they are acutely familiar with, areas likely closer to their home than adults. They also typically or often lack a car or even a license to facilitate further crimes away from the home.
Can I see your license?
Nah, I'm asking you a question, mate. Are you going to arrest yourself?
Okay, that's a new one, I'll give you that.
Yeah, now you show me your license. Yeah, exactly. Doesn't feel good, does it?
Major roads and rivers served as barriers to crime, while connectors such as trains increased the likelihood of criminalization, replacing the need for a car if you can just take the train. They also found that as the population of indigenous people increased in their study by 1%, so too did crime committed by all people, but particularly crime committed by indigenous peoples. Don't take that the wrong way, I'm just saying, statistically speaking. Stop! This means that areas with more heterogeneous populations may be more prone to crime, and not just any crime, but crime that originates and is committed by the residents of nearby areas or neighborhoods that are easily connected by public transit. Barriers such as rivers or major roads instead impede crime from nearby regions, meaning that criminals tend to victimize their own neighborhoods. This is particularly the case for juveniles and Australian Aboriginal people in this study. For those scratching their heads in confusion as to why people are looting or destroying their own neighborhoods, well, crime pattern theory provides one possible explanation. They do so because they're familiar with these places and can easily make their way back home without any confusion. This seems to fly in the face of the don't where you eat paradigm, but it explains why it so often seems to be the case. Our next theory, social disorganization theory, posits that crime will be more prevalent in areas that lack social cohesion or a sense of community, wherein criminals feel they would be able to get away with illegal acts without repercussion because there is a lack of a sense of community, wherein criminals would need fear intervention from neighbors. As mentioned in the findings of Claire, Fernandez, and Morgan, more diverse neighborhoods are more likely to be victimized by their own residents, and social disorganization provides a theoretical rationale as to why that may be the case. Bernesco and New Alberta, 2005, hypothesized that wealthier neighborhoods and highly heterogeneous neighborhoods with low social cohesion would both experience higher rates of burglary than would their less affluent and more homogeneous counterparts. They also hypothesized, in line with crime pattern theory, that burglars would target locations near their own homes or near a densely populated city center with many residencies to loot and connected to a variety of routes of escape. Looking at burglary data collected from the Netherlands and the city of Hague, their hypothesis regarding affluence was not supported, meaning criminals were not more likely to burglarize wealthy neighborhoods, but were more likely to burglarize homes near their own. They were also more likely to target residential areas that were densely packed, but not necessarily closer to the city center. Similarly to what we saw earlier, for every kilometer closer to the precipitator's home a target was, homes in that neighborhood were 1.67 times as likely to be targeted. When separated by age range, this was particularly influential in young people who were 2.2 times as likely to commit a burglary for every kilometer closer to their target they lived. Area heterogeneity, as expected, also predicted increased crime, such that as ethnic heterogeneity increased by 10 on a scale of 1 to 100, the likelihood that the area would be targeted for burglary increased, becoming 1.15 times as likely to be burglarized. This means people are not only more likely to trash their own areas of town, they're particularly likely to do so when those areas are diverse in population makeup, much as is the case with many major cities in the US. Looking specifically to riots and criminality, Bowdanes, Braithwaite, and Johnson, 2013, examined riots in the lens of social contagion, crime pattern theory, and social disorganization theory, so combining everything we've looked at so far, during the 2011 London riots, a situation which in many ways mirrors the current one in the US following the death of Mark Duggan in the UK after a confrontation with the police. They found that, in line with crime pattern theory, rioters were most likely to be arrested within 10 kilometers of their homes, occurring in pockets of civil unrest and reaching a peak before dying back down as thousands upon thousands of people were arrested during the riots. Reflecting what we've seen in the George Floyd protests, the majority of crimes committed were burglary and theft, as well as criminal damage. The tendency to choose a nearby location as a target was similar for both adults and adolescents, the latter of which typically, again, may not have their own cars, indicating access to transport doesn't stop one from destroying their own neighborhoods. However, on average, adolescents tended to riot closer to their home than adults did. Specifically, the odds ratio of committing crimes decreased by 0.6 for every kilometer further away criminals' homes were from the scene of their crimes. Public transit was also used by those who chose to rage outside their own direct neighborhood, such that the presence of a tube station doubled the likelihood of crime. But it wasn't just the proximity to a target that made it more prone to looting during the riot, it was also the density of retailers that drew in agitated anarchists. For every 250 meters of square retail space, the likelihood those shops would be targeted for looting rose by a factor of 1.38. Thus, with two adjacent neighborhoods being equidistant from a potential rioter's home, he or she will likely focus the aggression and illegal actions on the part of town with more retailers. Yet so often it's not the Sephora or the Anthropology being targeted by looters, as the businesses most affected are those in nearby, often impoverished areas. The odds ratio of a store being selected for robbery rose between 1.27 and 1.63 in economically deprived areas, evidence of social disorganization. Further, as the ethnic heterogeneity of an area increased by a unit of 10, offenses increased by a factor of 1.19. Finally, contagion was measured during this event, and the researchers found that the odds a place would be targeted for looting increased by 1.14 for every additional criminal incident that had occurred within the last 24 hours. In short, people loot their own impoverished neighborhoods, and as the looting starts in one area, more looters will join in on the bandwagon. What we can take away from the findings of Bowdings, Braithwaite, and Johnson is that rioters tend to stay close to their homes and subsequently are prone to destroy their own neighborhoods, in line with crime pattern theory. They look for places that they know they can knock over and quickly abscond from the scene, either by foot or by reliable public transit, so long as the victimized location is relatively nearby. Additionally, these acts tend to occur in impoverished neighborhoods with higher levels of racial and cultural heterogeneity, as such areas usually suffer from social disorganization. Neighbors don't know each other and likely lack any social ties beyond those depicted by a costume, which is why the Black Bloc is so named, "Don't rob me, I'm one of you." In contrast, when it comes to which homes to burglarize or businesses to loot, race may be more salient in heterogeneous neighborhoods, with the thought process likely being, I know non-black people live here or own this business. And who becomes a target is basically carte blanche so long as one thinks the area is diverse, even though they may end up destroying black-owned businesses because of the mere perception of racial diversity. And I want to really hammer that point home. Likely the reason why heterogeneous mixed-race neighborhoods get the brunt of the aggression and protests is actual racism in action based on thought or just informed guesses that the victim of the looting might be white or another race and therefore deserving of having their business targeted in recompense for a perceived slight. Of course, the irony lies in that many of the businesses in these heterogeneous neighborhoods, most of which are probably just scraping by, given the odds ratio of the stores being robbed being more commonly in those impoverished areas, may mean that it's actually black people and their businesses that suffer the brunt of this effect. Contagion also plays a role here, in that once the rioting and looting starts, it spreads like a plague to other neighborhoods. When those behaviors become norms, as people continually keep getting away with it, those norms spread. Why shouldn't you destroy and loot a black-owned business? Everyone else is doing it. # Black Lives Matter. So now that I've said the powerful words that have set countries ablaze, let's discuss the variables which precede crimes. Now that we have a basic framework, let's look at theories specifically related to precipitators of criminal behavior, things that encourage people to commit a crime, so start by buckling up and mentally preparing yourself because we're going to look at triggers. Bang, 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 for my devil trigger. Of course, in this context, triggers refers to aspects that lead someone to committing a crime, rather than inconsolable screeching. Marcus Newhall et al. 2000, in a meta-analysis of 122 texts, examined displaced aggression wherein people became aggravated by something and then took out their rage on an unrelated target. Displaced aggression is about what it sounds like. Consider a person who has had an absolutely abysmal day at work, for example. Tired and irritated, they log onto Twitter only to see what a dumpster fire it is. and in pent-up rage, they end up breaking their phone. The phone didn't do anything to deserve such ire, hence the anger is displaced. Much of the rioting and looting could be easily explained by this phenomena, such that I think many protesters would argue that their actions are just a form of grief and public mourning manifest. But under what condition does displaced anger occur, and have the protests following the death of George Floyd been a perfect shitstorm for this effect? There are two general ways to respond to a perceived injustice, either by avoiding confrontation or approaching it. In Marcus Newhall et al.'s model, those who approach their problem will react less severely than those who avoid it, saving their anger to be taken out elsewhere. One might think the more grievous the precipitator of displaced aggression, the more vitriolic the backlash will be when it does take shape. However, this was not the case. In contrast, the weaker the provocation, the more aggressive the response. Not only does this provide some clarity in understanding why people are so infuriated by a single police murder, and it was murder, don't get me wrong, when such things are hardly uncommon, sad to say as it is, and not to imply in any way that the actions of Derek Chauvin were justified, however, nor was George Floyd a perfect innocent, and he poorly fits the role of a martyr. This is not to imply, again, that Chauvin's actions were justified, far from it, but police violence is unfortunately not that rare.
At least he's only shooting the dirty cops.
Interestingly though, in this context, the weaker the provocation, the stronger the retaliatory response. Similarly, as the police stand down and allow themselves to be essentially bullied by the voracious mob, any perceived slight from the police only stokes the flames of rage from that mob, further diffusing their anger. This then turns in on itself cyclically. The people riot, the police try to stay out of it, and anything the cops do is then blown out of proportion, leading only to more rioting. The researchers also found that the more similar the initial provocation is to the target of the displaced aggression, the greater the magnitude of that aggression. When it comes to the cops, this makes perfect sense. One cop did something awful, therefore a cab, right? No one ever said emotions were logical, but it is displaced aggression and anger that seems to be playing a role here, and the US was a powder keg of social distancing, cabin fever, and 4 years of the orange man who is bad. So much so that the entire country, hell, the entire Anglosphere, was primed to explode with one last tiny provocation in the big scheme of things. Not all crime is purely emotional in nature, as Garcia Redamero and Dami 2009 examined the decision-making strategies in determining the target of a burglary across British non-offenders, police officers, and experienced burglars based on situational and environmental factors. They assessed two possible models of target choice: a weighted additive linear model, or WAD, as in wad of cash, am I right?
Oi you! Shut your mouth and look at my wad!
Or the simpler take the best strategy. The WAD model suggests that would-be criminals calculate which homes or businesses to burglarize by taking in and adding up as many indicators that would potentially facilitate a robbery as they can. That is, according to WAD, criminals will look for things like turned-off lights or a full mailbox to indicate the residence is likely temporarily vacant, as well as tall hedges to hide one's entrance, and first-floor doors or windows to provide easier access. In contrast, Take the Best or TTB strategy is faster, more heuristic type of decision-making, wherein two choices are weighted against each other based on quick assessment of which target will be more likely to result in a successful burglary, based on the same circumstantial factors as the WAD model. Because sizing up just one target and looking for signs of vulnerability can result in compensatory processing, while comparing two properties is non-compensatory and prone to choose the best based on visceral differences between the two. To be more clear, if you're looking to rob a specific house, your perception may overestimate symbols of dereliction or obfuscation in seeking excuses to select that house as a target, while when given the choice between two options, these two can be weighed against each other based on their comparative merit as targets. In other words, WAD processing is often less effective in looking for the perfect target than TTB processing, which weighs the cost and benefits of available targets. Given so many businesses are closed from the COOF, and police standing down, the 2020 rioting and looting provided a perfect opportunity for the supposedly peaceful protesters to vandalize, burglarize, and set fire to buildings when they know stores are closed and the police have no recourse. Now that we understand these two models of criminal behavior, do seasoned criminals choose targets differently from ordinary citizens? It seems so. The accused burglars paid the most attention to were the state of the residence, the type of residence, either a flat or a house, and the location of the target either on the corner of the street or in its center, as well as the presence of an alarm system. In contrast, the only variable the police and students rated as a more important cue than burglars was access to the door or windows being on the first floor. In terms of which strategy was utilized, while students and cops appeared to be distinct from burglars in the cues they considered important, police were, similarly to criminals, more likely to use the take-the-best processing in selecting targets, while students tended to utilize the weighted additive linear model. This means that seasoned criminals, or those who understand more about which locales are more likely to be targeted for crimes, tend to identify the same locations based on quick heuristics compared to their surroundings. Those who are new to crime tend to overthink it, potentially to their own detriment, often waiting for what seems like a perfect opportunity based on a combination of variables, when really, it may not be the best option. Students with little real-world, let alone criminal experience, are looking for a chance to steal from places after looking for specific opportunities wherever they can find them, rather than making quick heuristic decisions. This not only means that students tend to be bad criminals, it means they will wait for a seemingly perfect opportunity, perfect time and place to commit a crime, rather than acting expediently. What this means is that college-age kids deciding to engage in criminal behavior is not simply an act of irrational emotional outrage. Instead, the majority of these mostly young people who so hate the police likely don't have much or any experience with actual crime, and are therefore not likely to make the best choices for burglary, and instead wait for a seeming perfect opportunity to engage in illegal activity. The destruction and looting by these people isn't a heuristic or even an emotional outburst, it seems. It's a well-thought-out decision to engage in crime because they think they can get away with it, and they have gotten away with it. In this way, you could almost place a more villainous onus on the college student who waits for the perfect shot to act criminally than the career criminal who thinks on his or her feet. As Sun Tzu noted in his 36 stratagems, it's wise to loot a burning building when the enemy is weak. People not only may learn acceptable behavior by watching others, what is considered acceptable behavior may be dictated by the locale's cultural norms. That is, if a place has a reputation as being a violent, lawless war zone with a SoundCloud rapper lording over it, people will behave accordingly with their expectations of that place, as seen in research from Graham and Hummel 2012, in their entire book all about bars, nightclubs, and crime, amusingly called Raising the Bar. Get it? They found that places with shabby or dirty appearances, low lighting, lots of noise, and crowds were more prone to violence across Canada, Australia, the US, and the UK. That is, the dirtier, more worn down and crowded a place gets, it begins to exude an aura of criminality that may in part contribute to greater physical and non-physical altercations. When it concerns a riot, interestingly then, not only does this make less affluent areas of town more prone to crime in general, as the area is progressively more and more destroyed by rioters, the more normative violence becomes within that environment, reinforced by the state of the environment itself. Why are people destroying their own shithole cities? Well, perhaps in part because those areas are shitholes, or if they weren't before, then by the time the protesters are done defacing them, they may be, cultivating an environment conducive to more criminality. That is, people may look at the graffiti, the torn down statues, and think, well, this is a perfect place to break the law. Now that we understand some of the circumstances under which crime occurs, what pressures, social or personal or environmental, encourage criminal activity. Other people often have a big effect on our lives, and peer pressure can encourage all kinds of negative behaviors. People are inclined to go with the grain rather than against it, and that extends to group interaction in general, regardless of the environment in which the interaction occurs. To examine group effects, McGloin and Picaro 2009 examined delinquent behaviors based on juvenile arrest records from Philadelphia. They indicated that groups of juveniles tend to be more violent, with violence increasing as the number of people present at a crime scene increased. The number of offenses also increased as the number of offenders increased. Specifically, for every additional person with whom one person offends, the expected count of violent group offenses rose by 9.6%. Similarly, the odds of an individual's first group offense being violent increased by 33% for each additional person in the group. Thus, particularly for new offenders, the bigger the group, the vastly more likely violent rather than non-violent crime is to occur. Having one or more group members with previous criminal experience did not increase the likelihood that a group was likely to turn criminally violent, meaning that seemingly average, otherwise law-abiding people are as likely to fall into violent behavior as criminals are when a part of a group, particularly when part of a large group, As Terry Pratchett once said, the IQ of a mob is the IQ of its dumbest member divided by the number of mobsters. In this study, white males in a group were less likely than black people and all women to have committed their first offense while in a group. Across the sexes, the number of women included in this sample was too small to make any clear claims regarding sex differences, but the main takeaway is that people who might otherwise be law-abiding might turn out to be violent criminals when in a group. And this proclivity is stronger when white people who tend to commit fewer crimes in total than black America. No. That's a haram fact, just forget I brought that up. The point is, as group size increases, violence is also likely to increase because a crowd makes it difficult to identify individual offenders during the chaos of the mob. And as such, those otherwise not predisposed to criminality may be the ones most likely to become violent. While people will often conform to the behavior of their peers, they may also act out in deviance of rules and regulations. Psychological reactance is the tendency for people to not want to do what they're told is an act of rebellion intended to assert one's autonomy. Since laws essentially dictate what one can and can't do, could the existence of a lawless zone with a hobo king wherein there appears to be no repercussions for aberrant behavior and by its very nature encourage violence as a product of reactance? Put simply, will people do illegal things that they have been told not to do when they think they can get away with it? Allen, Sprankle, and Vitale, 1994, examined how rules changed behavior by looking at reported underage drinking as the United States began to implement statewide legal drinking ages of 21, up from the previous minimum of 18. While illegal drugs such as marijuana and crack cocaine maintained similar usage in underage people as well as in adults, drinking was more common in those under 21 than it was above the legal drinking age. Underage drinkers consumed more drinks at one time, more drinks while out, and more drinks in 1 month than did those over 21. Additionally, underage drinkers reported being more likely to go to a friend's house when they believed alcohol would be available than did over 21 adults. This indicates that not only does the illegality of an action potentially increase the likelihood of criminal behavior, but that would-be lawbreakers may seek out places such as a friend's house wherein they think they are less likely to be caught enacting an illegal behavior. In short, people will often be more likely to do something precisely because it's illegal and therefore kind of thrilling. Similarly, people may flock to chaotic riots, particularly after they feel reactance, as a result of perceived curtailing of their liberties, because that feeling of reactance encourages lawbreaking and because of the chaos said riot incurs, then helps obfuscate the individual into the crowd, making the chances of being caught slimmer than were the criminal behavior to be enacted while alone or in a smaller group. To illustrate the effects of reactance, Quick and Bates 2010 examined drinking behavior in response to advertisements which discouraged alcohol consumption with messages that were either high or low in self-efficacy and framed via loss or gain. Efficacy is the degree of control one believes he or she has over one's life events. High-efficacy messages emphasized that problems with alcohol were common and that respondents could receive help at the university health center, while the message low in efficacy emphasized personal accountability and gave no instructions on how to seek help. A gain frame emphasized that things can be gained by, in this case, cessation of alcohol consumption, including better health and eradication of fear of drunk driving. In contrast, the low efficacy frame instead makes note of the bad things that drinking can incur, such as driving drunk or suffering from various health problems, including stroke, liver damage, and even death, with no mention of help being available. Ultimately, the type of frame, either loss or gain, itself played no significant role in feelings that freedoms were being threatened. Threat was instead positively related to state, that is, context-dependent psychological reactance. Reactance was negatively related to source appraisals of the accuracy of the information from the health message and was positively related to the boomerang effect. The boomerang effect is the tendency to do the opposite of what a message is attempting to persuade one to do. Reactance was not related to attitudes towards drinking for those who had existing negative opinions towards alcohol. However, its use was related to opinions regarding the cessation of drinking. Loss framing was influential in those under 21, producing a greater reactance via a lack of freedom. Interestingly, gain frames also produced reactance, as those who saw the gain message alongside with a message of efficacy experienced a greater threat to their freedoms. In terms of the boomerang effect, state psychological reactance was positively related to increased drinking behavior. While one is experiencing reactance as a result of perceived threat to freedom, individuals may be more motivated to drink more alcohol, hang out with others who drink heavily, or engage in other prohibited behaviors. That is, telling someone that doing something is wrong may often serve as a threat to their freedoms, and only exacerbate the behavior. Interestingly, in juveniles, the gain frame provoked more reactance than the loss frame, indicating that even a gentle way of discouraging drinking behavior by emphasizing better health can have the opposite of the intended effect. Specifically, for underage drinkers, messages framed by gain, which include an efficacy appeal, were reacted to with anger. The researchers suggest this may be because such a message comes off as preachy or paternalistic. Because the health risks of drinking were one of the few variables that resulted in decreased proclivity to drink, while it's possible that gain frame messages with efficacy may only produce anger, loss frame messages may instead create reactance because, while gain frame messages emphasize the good things that come from cessation of drinking, loss frame messages instead emphasize a loss of freedom. The researchers propose that loss frames may be seen as impossible to live up to, and thus produce reactance, while gain frames emphasize the good that can be gained from quitting drinking in contrast to loss frames, which create a greater imposition upon their freedoms. That is, the more one is told not to do something, particularly when the message is framed from a loss perspective, say, rioting will result in a prison sentence, that frame may only encourage rioting and other related criminal behaviors. Once the behavior becomes normalized, it loses its symbol as a revolutionary act. Once the revolution ceases to be seen as revolutionary and becomes part of the daily grind, the allure of such a place will decrease. Much as how alcohol loses its allure once one becomes of the legal drinking age. Therefore, it's no wonder why people are so drawn to something like the Chaz or the Chop or whatever it's called, and prone to looting. It's because, in part, of that psychological reactance in response to rule of law. The zone gives people an opportunity to rebel for the sake of rebellion while still being relatively safe. The same effect is likely in part behind the tearing down of statues. Sure, it's illegal, but when no one is stopping it, said destruction is just rebellious enough. The act wouldn't have the same allure it currently does were it to be legal, much as was shown to be the case in adults and adolescents in terms of their alcohol consumption. Simply put,
it's fun to do bad things.
Particularly when you think you can get away with it. They've turned rioting into a commodity that people are afraid to miss out on. While reactance is often thought about in terms of how it may produce illegal behavior, the opposite can also be the case, as can be seen in Godbold and Pafal 2000, who looked at reactance in relationship to alcohol consumption over time based on the type of message frame, either informational or normative. In one condition, participants watched an anti-drinking PSA, which was either informational, neutral, or based on social norms, and then watched some commercials for alcoholic beverages. While the informational PSA focused on facts related to drinking, the normative appeal insisted that fewer adolescents drink than the viewer anticipates, and that friends are more likely to hang out with him or her when alcohol is not consumed. I'm not sure why anyone would buy that, given alcohol's reputation as a liquid courage, so weird flex, but okay.
You've consumed the most amount of alcohol a human being has ever drunk without dying.
Is that right? King of Beasts!
In an additional condition, there was a 2-week period between watching the PSA and watching the advertisements. For those who saw the ads immediately after the PSA, the normative PSA was the only one to produce significant results, with participants coming to view drinking as less acceptable when the anti-drinking ad relied on normative appeals, that is, peer pressure rather than information. This was the case both immediately following the PSA and 2 weeks later. This means that giving people information about healthy behaviors alone is unlikely to change those unhealthy behaviors. Instead, people tend to follow their social group when it comes to behavioral decisions. In the case of the current civil unrest, positive news coverage may have the same effect, fostering more positive attitudes towards rioting when the emphasis is placed on the peaceful protest of one's peer group. While in Godbold and Pafal, seeing a normative message about unhealthy side effects of alcohol produced lowered estimates of peer support for drinking, so too is it possible that seeing peer support for the protest increases perceptions of normalcy, and thus the protests, no matter how vicious, are also seen as normative given one's own peer group are the ones doing it. When the news and one's peer group are both insistent that the rioting and looting is somehow normal behavior, much as with underage drinking, the recipients of that message are more likely to join in with the chaos.
Race war? Come on, Bill! Race war!
Further evidence for the boomerang effect that reactance can elicit is present in Quick and Stevenson 2007 in the context of condom adverts. Participants in this study watched 7 different ads for condoms, and their level of reactance and anger was measured in response. Threat to choice, that is the threat produced by an ad that causes viewers to feel they must use condoms, was positively related to psychological reactance in all 7 ads. In turn, reactance was positively related to negative cognitions, that is, disagreement with the message of the advertisements, as well as being positively related to anger. Telling people to wrap it before they tap it then not only may result in the opposite effect, but may also piss people off because they don't like being told to wear a sock, and as a result may throw caution to the wind when in the bedroom. Finally, for every one of the ads, threat to choice were both directly and indirectly through reactance negatively related to the persuasiveness of the ad. When people experience reactance, when they feel their freedoms are being hindered, they will tend to have more negative thoughts and often feel enraged. Additionally, when people feel threatened, the intent of the message is often ignored. As such, when media stoked the flames of outrage in groups of people around the world with messages of police brutality and incited a fear of the police, those messages then produced reactance and a desire to rebel, fueled by negative thoughts and rage, all while messages intended to ameliorate said rage only add more crap to the pile. Anonymity is another important variable in understanding the bizarre behavior in the Chaz and in protests that have been occurring worldwide. As previously mentioned, the protesting crowd destroying their own cities is anonymous or at least pseudonymous, wearing masks and dark clothing and hats to obscure identification. Unlike other aggressive protests that so often turn to riots, in 2020 there's more than one reason to wear a mask. But the effects of mask wearing have long been studied by psychologists. In Philip Zimbardo's famous prison experiment, wherein participants were given the roles of prisoners or guards, in that semi-anonymous setting, people came to behave in ways that fit the role to which they were assigned, with guards becoming more violent towards prisoners. More recently, Selke 2003 examined the effects of anonymity in 500 violent crimes committed by or related to the IRA between 1994 and 1996.
Listen. Well, maybe not kill them, Kathleen, but lightly beat them with sticks or something. Or put them in camps, Kathleen, and start to teach them the beautiful Irish Gaelic.
They found that when offenders wore masks, they were considerably more likely to engage in illegal activity. Specifically, disguised persons were 8.3 times more likely than those who were not disguised to inflict serious injuries, 18.4% more likely to vandalize property, 17.7% more likely to attack multiple victims, and were 6.7% more likely to order the victim into exile. In summation, anonymous groups can often tend to be more violent in general and more prone to serious violent crimes, as a mask provides a level of security by allowing the masked individual to blend into the faceless mob. But when the mob rules, who makes rules for it? While we all know that rioting and looting is bad, well, maybe not all of us, countless individuals involved with the 2020 worldwide protests seem to be proud of their behavior, gleefully defacing public property and burning down small businesses. Yet if you were to ask these protesters, they would likely say something like they're fighting against injustice and standing up against a fascist government the only way they can. No justice, no peace, and such. They are giving themselves moral permission to act aggressively and violently and generally illegally. But are they acting logically? Look, I know the answer seems really obvious, but let's pretend for just a moment so we can provide some evidence to what seems so clear with data. Exactly how does destroying cities that almost exclusively lean to the left, the seats of Democrat power, make sense for attaining the protesters' goals? It might seem incomprehensible to an outside observer, because it is, but it may simply be an example of neutralization theory. According to this theory, both criminals and non-criminals know a certain behavior is wrong, either based on law or based on ethics, but convince themselves that it's morally neutral. The neutralization process is one through which an individual convinces him or herself that illegal behavior is acceptable by intentionally disengaging from ethical norms. Under this model, crimes then are a rationale and cognitive choice, not one of random haphazard chance.
My wife got recently. I was pretty bummed out about it. But I think whoever her was probably more happy to get it on than I am sad to get cucked. The total happiness in the world increased. So whatever.
McCarthy and Stewart, 1998, looked at neutralization in relationship with crime involvement. Low crime involvement describes someone who recognizes their actions are immoral, but finds it psychologically uncomfortable and subsequently uses excuses to explain to themselves why they commit crimes. More experienced criminals are high in involvement with crime, and more or less don't give a shit about neutralization and justifying their actions. High involvement criminals tend to receive more stringent sentences, which makes sense as they commit significantly more crimes. In this study, high and low involvement criminals read a series of scenarios involving hypothetical crimes and excuses given by the perpetrators. For both personal and property crimes, low involvement property and personal criminals, respectively, were the most likely to accept excuses than high involvement personal or property criminals. This indicates that more seasoned criminals are desensitized to crime, while those with little crime experience are prone to make and accept excuses for criminal behavior. For the people behind Chaz or Chop and the riots across the country, most are likely low in involvement, being unfamiliar with crime in general, and thus are likely to minimize their aberrant behavior as normal, accepting their excuses as valid. Via neutralization, people who commit crimes know what they are doing is wrong, but talk themselves into believing that there are excuses for their actions. In this way, criminals mitigate negative feelings associated with crime. Topali 2005 interviewed 191 criminals to assess neutralization and the decision-making process behind their crimes. They found that criminals have their own moral code that helps them excuse their behavior by maintaining their own set of rules, essentially being a good bad guy. I know this seems obvious if you've ever watched a mafia film, but there it is.
Oh, you're not sure? Wheels, come over here. This guy ain't sure. This is my friend Wheels. We invited him into the family, and he said, I'm not sure, and somehow his legs got broke, but I didn't see what happened. Did you boys see what happened?
The respondents here were African Americans who had committed mostly solo, non-deadly crimes including robbery, carjacking, drug dealing, and drug robbery, and had the same mindset that their crimes were necessary. Participants noted how snitching was seen as a far more egregious offense than being arrested themselves, with one saying he would die before he snitched, and yet another admitting to snitching because he wasn't close friends with his co-offenders. A rationale for snitching from a drug dealer and prostitute named Peaches was simply a hatred of the police, giving cops false information justifying to herself that she was loyal even though she admitted to having snitched in the past. Another criminal eloquently named Sleazy E mirrored the sentiment, admitting that he would give the police false information just to be let free. So perhaps there is some honor among thieves, but only so long as it doesn't threaten their own well-being. Not all crime is cognitive, it's not all a rational choice, as that should seem obvious prima facie that most violent crime is expressive and based on emotional outbursts. But does that mean the actions of people in response to the death of George Floyd, or even in response to the response, are acting out of blind rage? After all, the difference between a life and death sentence between murder and manslaughter is often dependent on one's emotional state. Van Gelder 2013 proposed a hot and cold model of criminal decision-making, a constant struggle between the cool cognitive thought processes and the hot emotional aspects of criminality. This helps to explain why criminals so often behave irrationally, their cold cognitive side being at odds with their scalding sensations. Evidence for this hot and cold function can be seen also in Piquero and Tibet's 1996, who examined the thought processes, or lack thereof, of shoplifters. Low self-control was related both directly and indirectly through the perceived pleasure that having possessions elicits, to intentions to shoplift. At the same time, moral beliefs were negatively related to shoplifting directly. Indirectly, morals were positively related to shame, which in turn was negatively related to intentions to shoplift. Similar results were forwarded for drunk driving as well. Criminal acts then do seem to be partially cognitive and partially emotional. For as much as many would like to claim that the riots are just coping or mourning, why then are so many people wearing masks and black clothing if they weren't thinking ahead about the potential consequences of their behavior? The answer is likely, like most things in social science, it's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. What's clear though is that morality may prevent looting, while having low self-control, as many people rioting seem to have, instead encourages it. People will often use any available scapegoat to explain away their actions, whether that be the death of a man thousands of miles away, even in a different country, or the orange man who is bad. Anyone or anything can be used as an excuse for negative actions. A review of alcohol literature from Leonard 2002 found that people believe alcohol causes aggression, that those who drive drunk should be given less blame for their actions than those who are sober, and that alcohol just causes violence. This indicates that it's possible that when people think a situation should produce increased aggression, the event itself may serve as a placebo effect, increasing aggression because of a belief that such an environment should be typified by it. This is essentially the "I couldn't help it" excuse for excessive or violent behaviors, or perhaps more aptly for Leonard's review, the "blame it on the alcohol" defense. It is possible that people just don't realize the extent of the harm their actions cause when caught up in the heat of the moment, and subsequently excuse their behaviors as a product of emotion. After all, when everyone around you is setting the world on fire, what's the harm in adding a little fuel? Before I get into the evidence, it's worth noting that the studies I've found on the aspect of minimizing the consequences of crime are quite old, and therefore it's possible that replication today might forward different results. So take this with a grain of salt, but also consider why findings might be different now in an age where everyone has access to a camera in their back pocket. Regardless, these studies give us some insight, so let's take a look at one. Vanderstoep and Graham, 1987, conducted a unique experiment that allowed them to track delinquent behavior in a national park. Over 12 weeks, groups of visitors to Shiloh National Military Park were given a presentation regarding damage to the park's monuments and wildlife by other visitors. Some participants were told about the damage to the park and how climbing on or touching statues destroys their protective patina. Another group received the first message and then were invited to join a program wherein they would take note of damage to statues and park facilities and return the list to the park service. A third group received the previous two messages and were told they could win an award for their assistance. During their visit, 4 cameras fixed on monuments recorded the behavior of the participants. Those who received no message at all committed far more acts of vandalism than any of the experimental conditions. This indicates that merely being told not to do something, specifically not to deface a public park, actually decreases the likelihood of vandalism. Just telling people it's not okay more than halves the destructive behavior. As the message got longer and when it included a reward for not being a douche, defacement increased slightly but was still far lower than when there was no message. This may be evidence of reactance as people started to get irritated by longer messages telling participants what to do. Is it any surprise then that when the mainstream media champions riots and destruction of monuments and statues, which often have diddly squat to do with the current outrage as stunning and brave, rather than what it is, a crime, that people are then prone to go out and riot and deface more statues? Potentially even hearing from anyone that this behavior is wrong might mitigate some of it, but the sycophantic media messages celebrating this behavior won't have that effect and are not intended to. I mean, there's discussion to remove a statue of Abraham Lincoln paid for by freed slaves of all things, and they've already torn down and beheaded a statue of an anti-slavery activist, the Civil War Colonel Hans Christian Haig, who died defending his beliefs.
Haig was the most noted Norwegian American to serve in the Union Army during the Civil War, and he was also a noted abolitionist.
Great job.
Maybe just being told, hey there friend, you might need to slow it down, would have some positive effect on this deleterious reactionary criminality, but we'll likely never find out because condemning it is to condemn yourself and possibly lose your job. Speaking of slowing it down, I'm sorry I got a little worked up there. Let's all calm down by going back to the studies then. Another aged one from Carter 1988 investigated theft by employees from tills and inventory at a grocery store in Sweden. The researchers used a publicly posted graph in the lunchroom which contained information about the problem of employee theft and to track incidences of missing objects for all of the workers to see. Personal hygiene products, candy, and trinket jewelry were tracked, as they were the most commonly stolen items. For candy, theft rates averaged 4.7 per day before intervention and 1.2 after intervention. For personal hygiene products, theft rates averaged 1.6 per day before intervention and 0.8 per day after intervention. Finally, for jewelry, the theft rate during the baseline was 2 per day, whereas only 1 item was stolen during the 3-week intervention period. Overall, thefts were reduced from an average of 8 per day to 2 per day. When people think that their actions are being watched and are shown the consequences of illegal behavior, in this case seeing the graph charting thefts every day, they may feel guilt for their behavior and be less prone to commit such acts in the future. Or so long as they think they're being monitored at least. Being shown the physical ramifications of crime, be it by monitoring the destruction of property or seeing the manifest cost of criminal theft, even if it's just a piece of candy, may reduce that crime. Therefore, the media's insistence that everything is just a peaceful protest specifically will do nothing to curb that behavior, and may even encourage it. After all, these aren't dangerous riots that have caused over 20 confirmed deaths at the time of this recording, you bigot. It's the summer of love.
How long do you think Seattle and those few blocks looks like this?
I don't know. We could have the summer of love.
Another aspect of crime that may embolden the criminal is minimizing the victims. By downplaying the humanity of those that suffer as a result of crime, criminals attempt to convince themselves that their actions are justified or necessary. For answers to this, we can look to Lindgaard 2014, who examined the emotions that thieves reported before, during, and after a robbery. But first, let's take a second to really appreciate the title of this paper, Posterior Pains and Immediate Gains. It's legitimately a study about butthurt criminals. But that's just one of the reasons I love the social sciences so much. Anyway, before and during the crime, emotions included fear, anger, and a sense of challenge, while after the robbery, criminals reported happiness, fear, and shame. Looking further into these emotions, interviews with perpetrators can shed more light on the state of mind while committing criminal acts. While fear and challenge before the crime seem obvious, sometimes anger over unrelated issues can prompt a robbery. As one participant admits to pulling a knife and robbing some young adults, young people, okay, look, the study describes them as youngsters, and I may be old, but I'm not that old to use the term youngsters, not quite yet. Anyway, this guy pulls a knife on some kids all because they were taunting him. Bit of an extreme reaction, but that's an example of anger felt before a crime.
Give me the Timbs. Give me the Timbs. Give me the Timbs right now. Not the Timbs.
One participant noted that while robberies presented a challenge, it also made him feel confident. Here, anger towards the victim was again present, with one felon admitting to shooting a man because he didn't have enough money to satiate his desires. What this says about protests and the behavior occurring during them is that they are often likely motivated by irrational anger, and that the perpetrators would feel likely guilty after the fact. Then again, they might also feel happy about it. Anger seems to be consistent during and before the crime, and frequently that anger is directed toward the victim. This propensity was also present in interviews with criminals from Indenmauer 1996, who found that 49% of perpetrators used violence against robbery victims, typically because said victims resisted, justifying to themselves that violence was the only option. One offender described the rationale for beating a man who was already on the ground with a crowbar because another victim had entered the room. Thus, the criminal felt it was necessary to beat him as if he had done something wrong, or as if he had intentionally provoked that response. So with that in mind, let's look at psychological provocations. In addition to excusing one's behavior by giving the self permission to enact crimes, blaming the victim allows a criminal to frame the situation as a provocation, thus minimizing their own responsibility in criminal acts. Many protesters may say they have no choice but to loot and riot because they were provoked by the death of Floyd, or by, I don't know, Trump existing, or really anything convenient to just not take the blame, and to find a convenient scapegoat as to point to for a rationale as to why they had to riot or loot. Thus, it doesn't just end with blaming the victim, no, offenders will frequently look for almost any excuse to justify their behavior, as seen in Cousins and Grieve 2014, and their analysis of aggression at nightclubs. Clubs with less comfortable, more harsh features were prone to more violent events. While it is impossible, based on these correlational level data, to determine which came first, heightened security or a tougher crowd, it does indicate that the two come in tandem. As the Chaz and areas around it become more violent and aggressive, it's possible that aggression turns in upon itself and creates an environment that promotes more aggression and violence. This was also reflected in Graham and Hommel 2008, who found that shadier-looking clubs saw increased violent crime. This means that people will often behave in a way that reflects their environment, and may even become violent in their attempts to be accepted into the salty spittoon instead of Weenie Hut Juniors. Once again though, here we see criminality turning in among itself. For the more aggression and violent destruction incurred in these areas, the more dilapidated they look, the more aggressive and violent the crowd becomes in response. The very presence of a crowd may itself provoke antisocial behavior, as seen in data from Townsley and Grimshaw 2013 in their assessment of Brisbane nightclubs. So many Australian studies here, I guess it really is the world's largest prison experiment. Sorry, Aussies.
Australia. I live here and I still can't figure out if we're the worst people on earth or the best.
Anyway, they found that crowding in the queue was a greater single predictor of crowd violence than any other variable, including alcohol consumption. Crowding was such a strong determinant of aggression that the difference between low and average levels of crowding was 5 incidences of aggression. While alcohol was a predictor of aggression itself, crowding was just more powerful. When people are packed into giant mobs of angry protesters then, it's no wonder that they too would be more aggressive if the same results can be obtained from a simple waiting line. Crowds are easy to anger, and when angry, equally as easy to become aggressive towards others. As such, one would argue that the environment around them is to blame. I didn't start it, he started it. In crowds, it's easy to shift the blame onto others and subsequently end up engaging in the same destructive behavior just because everyone else is doing it. Because crowds are inherently partially anonymous, not only because in said crowds people are wearing masks, but also just due to the sheer number of people, this makes crowds prone to de-individuation effects. The social identity model of de-individuation effects, or SIDE, posits that when anonymous, group norms will supersede individualism. Triobowo 2018 examined SIDE in association with online political petition signing, given that the internet allows for high levels of anonymity, and found some evidence for a kind of one-click activism, with individual participants being anonymous and looking for certainty by attempting to determine and choose answers to questions that they thought were subjectively normative. Thus, attitudes towards the petition and one's social group identity are both related to relative subjective norms, which in turn is related to intentions to sign a petition and subsequently complete it. In other words, when it comes to political opinions, anonymous or pseudonymous persons are likely to go along with whatever they think is normal for their group. With the mainstream media praising the riots along with the Chaz or Chop or again whatever it's being called by the time you're watching it, that praise for people who already tend to agree serves as a bolster for their opinions and subsequently a positive view of the protests as well as a likelihood to involve the self anonymously either on foot or online. Rains et al. 2018 further used SIDE to investigate online incivility, aka digital slacktivism, using the comment section thumbs up or thumbs down left in the community forums of the Arizona Daily Star. They found that contrary to their expectations, conservatives generally remained civil online, even when they outnumbered liberals, leftists, whatever you want to define the mainstream left as in the United States. Anyway, both conservatives and liberals who left mean comments received more thumbs up. However, this was more pronounced in liberal readers and commenters. Specifically, all comments from conservatives received an average of 1.69 more thumbs down than did liberal posts. Further, people in general were not fond of uncivil discourse, as rude posts tended to receive 1.4 times fewer thumbs up. While both general political leanings can be douchebags when anonymous, generally speaking, liberals do tend to be less civil. Is it any surprise then that when the offline environment is similarly anonymous, they also throw civility to the wind? Moreover, these data are evidence that conservatives do not change how they express themselves in the face of incivility, while non-conservatives become more reactive to group membership in the presence of said incivility. Liberals are just more prone to reactive incivility then when anonymous, and that's exactly what we've seen with the rampant destruction that the riots have elicited. Other environmental factors beyond just the aesthetics of an establishment or the online space include the actual environment, not just where the crime takes place, but the very weather, which can increase aggression. Often as an example of why correlation is not causation, stats folk will bring up that there's a strong correlation between ice cream sales and violent crime. That's true. However, it's not because one causes the other, but rather because both are related to heat. Anderson et al. 2000, in a review of research on heat and violence, found consistently that month by month, as the heat rose, so too did assault, domestic violence, and struggle snuggles. They forwarded a general effective aggression model where an external variable such as heat and internal variables such as trait aggression come together to result in aggressive thoughts or feelings and increased arousal. When under these conditions, a threat is perceived and is either reappraised in a controlled way, leading often to later action such as revenge, or to immediate aggressive response. For most people irritated by the heat, this may just result in some name-calling. But as the temperature rises, so too do tensions until people are rioting in the streets. After all, heat madness may partially explain the existence of Florida Man.
My name's Deputy English. Hey man, the reason I'm pulling you over is your derogatory sticker on the back of your truck. What is that? How's it not derogatory?
It's words.
It's words, okay. What does those words mean?
It's ass and eat.
I eat ass.
And again, this can be used as an excuse for why people become more aggressive, rather than blaming others, blaming the weather for making everyone uncomfortable. So, since people give themselves permission to act immorally and excuse away their behavior due to environmental circumstances, are career criminals as likely to explain away their actions as non-criminals are? Given that the vast majority of people throwing a collective temper tantrum in the streets are likely not hardened criminals, we should look at the research on petty crime and theft. Egan and Taylor 2010 looked at individual differences in personalities of shoplifters, and given the amount of shoplifting and looting that occurred in the wake of George Floyd's death, it's a pretty relevant crime to examine in more detail. There was no difference in personality or attitudes among those who had previously shoplifted but no longer engaged in that behavior, or those who had never shoplifted. Current shoplifters, however, were high in emotional stability, openness, and extroversion, but low in agreeableness and conscientiousness. This is interesting because of how it aligns with Carney et al.'s 2008 categorization of political ideology in comparison with the Big Five personality traits using studies conducted over 77 years. Traits positively associated with liberalism or left-wing politics are openness and extroversion, while conservatism tends to be positively related to conscientiousness and negatively related to openness, extroversion, and agreeableness. Extroversion was not directly related to dishonest consumer behavior, but was related to unethical consumer actions, which include things such as intentionally using a coupon for the wrong item. Both agreeableness and conscientiousness were negatively related to dishonest consumer behavior, which itself was positively related to shoplifting. Age was negatively related to extroversion, meaning young people were more likely to be extroverted, while age was positively related to conscientiousness. Younger people were also more likely to be unethical in general. While dishonest consumer behavior was positively associated with shoplifting, both conscientiousness and agreeableness were negatively related to dishonest behavior. Extroversion, then, is the main variable indirectly related positively to dishonest consumer behavior and therefore shoplifting. This all means that people who tend to lean left are indirectly, given they tend to be high in extroversion, potentially more likely to shoplift. And what this all means together is that left-leaning people, particularly those high in openness and extroversion and low in conscientiousness, are just more prone to shoplifting in general. Obviously, people know on some level that rioting and looting is wrong and illegal. How then do people justify to themselves that such behavior is okay? There was a rallying cry behind the death of Floyd, yet his death was an isolated incident, one of many police murders. This is not to laud the actions of Derek Chauvin, again, far from it, but it is to say that it's unlikely the rioting is all a reaction to injustice and not just pure opportunism in many cases. Once someone has done something, it minimizes the risk of joining in with the same behavior, with people often thinking that because everyone else is doing it, he or she should do it too. It's just part and parcel of living in a big city, I guess. Greenberg 2002 examined criminal opportunism in relationship to penny theft rather than petty theft. In this study, customer service people were given a survey to fill out during work hours, filling out papers that assess their morality as either conventional or pre-conventional. Kohlberg's Stages of Moral Development defines conventional morality as containing ideas such as duty to others or to be kind to others, while pre-conventional morality, as you might expect, is based on doing what feels good in the moment or engaging in immoral activities, so long as one believes he or she won't be caught. Participants were told to take their payment for participation in the study, a measly $2, from a bowl of pennies on the table, counting out the precise amount for themselves, while the interviewer waited outside. After each session, the coins were counted and the bowl refilled. Participants were either told that the money came from the company or from the manager's own pockets. Finally, companies were differentiated based on whether or not employees had undergone a workplace ethics program. Generally speaking, employees were much more likely to steal from the company rather than from a manager. People with a more developed sense of morality were only significantly less likely to steal pennies when they had been through an ethics program. However, those with a pre-conventional morality did not benefit from such a program. This makes sense when we look to people rioting and looting. Pre-conventional morality seems to typify those engaging in this behavior, seeking out temporary, fleeting positive emotions, such as the rush from breaking the law or stealing something that they want. Moreover, given much of the destruction in the Chaz occurred after the police were told to stand down, it's no surprise that the rioters feel free to engage in said destruction, thinking they're invulnerable from recourse. Not only do criminals think they're invulnerable, they may actually gain pleasure from criminal acts, and take any opportunity to excuse themselves precisely because of that dopamine such actions elicit. Newburn 2016 interviewed people who had participated in the 2011 London riots. Again, respondents noted a feeling of invulnerability, reveling in the notion that they might not get caught. Further, they noted feelings of accomplishment and personal achievement for actions such as throwing a brick at a police van. This made respondents feel as if they had control over the situation, that they were, quote, ruling their streets. They felt that they had the authority and expressed that authority by trashing their city. Along with this feeling of control came overwhelming feelings of happiness, mixed with the fears of being caught. While some respondents were afraid or angry regarding the impetus behind the riots, the death of Mark Duggan, others were pure opportunists, seeing the riots as a chance to steal and loot. Many more were on cloud nine amidst the chaos, or in the words of one 18-year-old male participant,
I was having a laugh, I swear to God, it was like a dream, it's like a game, you know what I mean? It's better than a game. I was actually doing it, I felt alive. No word to really explain it. It was like the first day it happened, will always be the best day of my life forever, I swear to God.
These are just some poignant examples of how rioters felt, and can serve as a comparison for those destroying their own cities now. They find it fun, euphoric even, tip tip, and all just a game for their enjoyment. Hence the riots probably aren't wholly a reaction to a man's death, but rather an excuse to play revolutionary, with no regard for who gets hurt in the process. And with all of that in mind, let's come to some conclusions. Today, we've looked at everything from theories of criminal behavior to provoking factors of rioting and looting, to the psychology of the criminal and non-criminal mind when it concerns public outrage or the opportunity to engage in illegal activity. Rioting is socially contagious, spreading more efficiently than some viruses that we're supposed to be so concerned about while thousands gather in the streets, in protest. We have seen that people tend to vandalize their own neighborhoods both for easy escape and because they're more familiar with them. Thus so many people shitting where they eat. It's no wonder why people destroy their own neighborhoods when said neighborhoods lack social cohesion, and I can't tell you who or what is to blame for that, but racially heterogeneous neighborhoods tend to lack that cohesion and thus are more susceptible to crimes. Big cities, therefore, are particularly vulnerable. People embroiled in riots will give themselves permission to loot and destroy by coming up with rationales for why their behavior is justified. To further solidify this belief in the righteousness of their criminal behavior, they'll create excuses and shift the blame for their actions onto other people, places, and things around them, all while holding the self to little or no accountability. Moreover, looting is rarely the product of emotional outbursts and instead tends to be a cognitive choice to engage in that illegal behavior. This is the psychology of the virtue signaler and the perpetually offended to always be in the right no matter how much wrong is done, and if caught, to so easily blame the circumstances that they themselves created. But hey, what do you guys think? Do you think that the protests are more an emotional action or more a planned and cognitive one? Why else might people be trashing their own neighborhoods and looting local stores rather than looking for the wealthiest targets? Do you think any of the excuses criminals often rely on apply to the 2020 civil unrest? If you're interested, check out the link to Surfshark VPN or my merch store, as well as my Patreon and Subscribestar if you want to help out the channel. Of course, an enormous thank you to all of my supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar. You guys are amazing and truly help keep this channel going, because there is no way a video like this one's getting monetized. You guys are all truly amazing. Finally, if you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing if you're not already subscribed or got unsubscribed. And as always, dear friends, Altana Volt.